The United States government helped enslave tens of thousands of Africans in the 20th century, not in the 1800s, but in the 1930s, and not in secret, but with full knowledge at the highest levels of the State Department. This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration. In 1930, a League of Nations International Commission investigated conditions on rubber plantations in Liberia and concluded that what they found constituted forced labor hardly distinguishable from slavery. The plantations belonged to the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio, and when the Commission's findings threatened to become public, the American government moved to bury them. But the full scope of Washington's involvement, the diplomatic cables, the backroom deals, the deliberate suppression of evidence, would not be understood for decades. And what it reveals is not just a corporate scandal. It is a blueprint for how economic interests can override human rights when powerful institutions decide that certain lives are expendable. In the early 1920s, Harvey Firestone had a problem. The British controlled the global rubber supply through their colonial plantations in Southeast Asia, and the Stevenson Restriction Act of 1922 had driven rubber prices to punishing heights. Firestone, whose tire empire depended on cheap rubber, needed an alternative source. He found one in Liberia. Liberia occupied a strange position in the world order. Founded in 1847 by formerly enslaved Americans, it was technically an independent republic. But its economy was in ruins, its government was broke, and its ruling Americo-Liberian elite, descendants of those settlers, maintained power over the indigenous majority through patronage and coercion. In 1926, Firestone signed a 99-year concession with the Liberian government, leasing up to 1 million acres of land for rubber cultivation. The deal came with a $5 million loan through the Finance Corporation of America, a Firestone subsidiary. The terms were staggering. Liberia was effectively mortgaging its sovereignty to a tire company, and to make the plantations profitable, Firestone needed labor. Enormous amounts of it. The question of where that labor would come from and how it would be obtained is where this story turns dark. The workers did not come willingly. Liberia's indigenous populations, the Kru, Grebo, Bassa, and other groups, had no interest in tapping rubber for foreign wages that barely qualified as compensation. So the Liberian government provided them anyway. District commissioners and paramount chiefs were given quotas. Villages were required to supply men for plantation work. Those who resisted faced punishment. The Liberian Frontier Force, a government militia with a reputation for brutality, enforced compliance. Men were rounded up, marched to Firestone's concession areas, and put to work under conditions of extreme deprivation. Workers tapped trees from dawn until dark. Pay was minimal, often withheld, sometimes non-existent. Housing was crude. Medical care was scarce. The system functioned through coercion at every level. The government compelled the chiefs compelled the villagers, and the villagers had no recourse. Firestone's managers knew. The company's own internal reports documented the recruitment methods. But production targets were being met, and rubber was flowing to Akron. That was what mattered. What few people outside Liberia realized, and what would soon force an international crisis, was that this same system extended far beyond the Firestone plantations. The scandal broke not because of the rubber plantations, but because of a related atrocity. In 1929, the American legation in Monrovia received credible reports that senior Liberian officials, including Vice President Allen Yancey, were involved in the forced shipment of indigenous laborers to the Spanish colony of Fernando Po, an island off the coast of West Africa. The conditions there were even worse. Workers were sold to cocoa planters under contracts they had not signed. Many never returned. The allegations triggered an international investigation. The League of Nations established a commission of inquiry in 1930, chaired by a British physician named Cuthbert Christie, with an American member, Charles S. Johnson, the distinguished black sociologist from Fisk University. The commission arrived in Liberia in April 1930 and spent months interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents, and traveling to the interior. Their findings were damning. The commission confirmed the existence of forced labor practices amounting to slavery, implicating Vice President Yancey and other high-ranking officials, but the report went further. It documented the broader system of compulsory labor that supplied workers not only to Fernando Po, but also to private concessions within Liberia, including Firestones. President Charles D.B. King resigned in December 1930 under pressure. Yancey was also forced out. The League of Nations began debating what to do about Liberia, and then the American government stepped in, not to help, but to contain the damage. Washington had a problem. The Christie Commission's report threatened to expose Firestone's complicity in a system the League of Nations had officially compared to slavery. If the full findings gained traction, American commercial interests in Liberia could be jeopardized. Worse, the controversy might invite European colonial powers to assert control over Liberia, an outcome that would eliminate American influence entirely. The State Department's response was deliberate and calculated. Diplomatic cables from the period, later unearthed by historians including Ibrahim Sundiata, reveal a coordinated effort to minimize Firestone's exposure. American diplomats in Geneva worked to soften the League's proposed reforms. They argued against international supervision of Liberia's labor practices, framing it as an infringement on sovereignty that the Firestone loan agreement had already hollowed out. Behind the scenes, the State Department pressured the Liberian government to implement cosmetic reforms that would satisfy the League without fundamentally changing the labor system. The strategy was delay, deflect, let the controversy exhaust itself. Harvey Firestone himself lobbied Washington directly, and his representatives maintained close contact with State Department officials throughout the crisis. The company's position was simple. Firestone did not recruit workers, the Liberian government did. If there were abuses, they were Liberia's problem. It was a masterpiece of plausible deniability, and the State Department helped construct it. The League of Nations spent years debating the Liberia question. Proposals for an international advisory committee, for a mandate system, for direct supervision, all were discussed, diluted, and ultimately abandoned. The United States, though not a League member, exerted influence through back channels, consistently opposing any mechanism that would place Firestone's operations under international scrutiny. The U.S. Public Health Service played its own quiet role. In 1930, the USPHS had sent a medical mission to Liberia at the Liberian government's request, ostensibly to study tropical diseases. But the mission's findings about health conditions on the plantations were handled carefully. Data that might have corroborated the Commission's forced labor findings was channeled through diplomatic rather than public health pathways. The priority was control of the narrative, not the welfare of the workers. By 1934, the League of Nations had effectively given up. An assistance plan was proposed but never implemented. Liberia withdrew from the League in 1935. The international spotlight moved on, to Abyssinia, to the gathering storm in Europe, to crises that commanded more attention. The workers on Firestone's plantations remained where they were. Firestone's Liberian operations continued for decades. Rubber flowed, profits accumulated. During World War II, when Japanese forces seized Southeast Asian rubber sources, the Liberian plantations became strategically indispensable. The same labor system that the League of Nations had condemned now served the Allied war effort. No one raised the slavery comparison again. The company's Harble plantation grew into the largest contiguous rubber operation in the world. Generations of Liberian workers lived and died on its grounds. Reforms came slowly, grudgingly, and always under pressure from below, rather than above. The Firestone family maintained its concession through coups, civil wars, and regime changes, renegotiating terms with each new government. The fundamental power imbalance, a multinational corporation holding more economic leverage than the host nation, never shifted. Charles S. Johnson, the American commissioner who had documented the abuses firsthand, published his findings in academic journals. They were read by scholars. They changed nothing on the ground. The State Department's cables sat in archives, waiting for historians who would not arrive for another half-century. The Firestone Liberia scandal is not an obscure footnote. It is a case study in how democratic governments become complicit in exploitation when commercial interests align with strategic priorities. The United States did not simply fail to act, it actively intervened, not to stop forced labor, but to ensure that the revelation of forced labor did not disrupt the supply of rubber. Every institution that should have provided a check failed. The State Department chose commerce over conscience. The League of Nations chose consensus over enforcement. The press covered the story briefly, then moved on. The workers, the crew and Grabo and Bassa men who tapped the trees and built the roads and cleared the forests had no lobby, no representation, no voice that carried beyond the tree line. Liberia's modern history cannot be separated from what happened on those plantations. The inequalities between the Americo-Liberian elite and the indigenous majority, the weakness of state institutions, the dependency on foreign capital, these patterns were not accidents. They were engineered, maintained, and protected by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Some debts are never entered into the books. The rubber that rolled off Firestone's production lines in Akron became the tires on American cars, the treads on military vehicles, the seals on industrial machinery. Somewhere between the latex and the ledger, the human cost was absorbed, rounded down, written off. The men who bled the trees were never named in any quarterly report, but they were always there, in every rotation of every wheel, in the compound silence of every institution that knew and never spoke.